A recent book from James K. A. Smith is called How Not to Be Secular. It is a concise and friendly introduction to the weighty and magisterial study by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. Smith launches his discussion of Taylor by imagining a young pastor or church planter moving from the Bible Belt or Grand Rapids to a coastal urban center, eager to be welcomed as a bearer of a message that can satisfy the restless yearning for God that all those unchurched folk must be feeling. But after arriving in the New Babylon, ready to give answers so desperately desired, Smith's imaginary pastor discovers that his unchurched neighbors don't really have any burning questions. Quote, "There doesn't seem to be anything missing from their lives, so you can't just come proclaiming the good news of a Jesus who fills their God-shaped hole." It turns out that this isn't like the Mars Hill of St. Paul's experience in Acts 17, where people are devoted to all kinds of deities and you get to add to their pantheon by talking about the one true God. Close quote. When I read that passage, I was reminded of two little-known essays by C.S. Lewis. The first is called Modern Man and His Categories of Thought, and it discussed the condition that Charles Taylor was to diagnose many decades later. Lewis begins by describing the circumstances of the original proclamation of the gospel in places like Mars Hill by the apostles. They spoke to three classes of listeners, Lewis observes: Jews, Judaizing Gentiles, and pagans. And despite the differences between these three groups, they all had much in common with each other and with Christians. Quote, "All three classes believed in the supernatural. All were conscious of sin and feared divine judgment. And in all three classes, most men believed that the world had once been better than it now was." Close quote. That is, they believed that actual human history contained something like the fall. Lewis goes on to say that, quote, "The world which we must try to convert shares none of those predispositions. In the last 100 years, the public mind has been radically altered." Close quote. And in the remainder of the essay, Lewis summarizes several key assumptions of the modern imagination that are barriers to belief rather than sources of receptivity. And near the end of that essay, C.S. Lewis, the man widely regarded as the most adept apologist of the 20th century, seems to throw up his hands at the hopeless task of evangelism in the modern world. Quote, "I sometimes wonder whether we shall not have to reconvert men to real paganism as a preliminary to converting them to Christianity. If they were Stoics, Orphics, Mithraists, or, better still, peasants worshipping the earth, our task might be easier. This is why I do not regard contemporary paganisms as a wholly bad symptom." Close quote. In another essay called Is Theism Important?, Lewis expresses the same sense of futility. Quote, "When grave persons express their fear that England is relapsing into paganism, I am tempted to reply, would that she were, for I do not think it at all likely that we shall ever see Parliament opened by the slaughtering of a garlanded white bull in the House of Lords, or cabinet ministers leaving sandwiches in Hyde Park as an offering for the Dryads. If such a state of affairs came about, then the Christian apologist would have something to work on. For a pagan, as history shows, is a man eminently convertible to Christianity. He is essentially the pre-Christian or sub-Christian religious man. The post-Christian man of our day differs from him as much as a divorcee differs from a virgin. The Christian and the pagan have much more in common with one another than either has with the writers of the New Statesman, and those writers would, of course, agree with me." Close quote. Charles Taylor's A Secular Age is a 900-page telling of the story of how we got here. James K. A. Smith's book, How Not to Be Secular, is an introductory summary to the story told in Taylor's book. It's written by a philosopher with a love of storytelling and the heart of an apologist. Central to the narrative that Taylor tells is a changing definition in the idea of the secular. And early in his own book, Jamie Smith helpfully summarizes the threefold taxonomy of secular that Taylor uses. In classical and medieval usage, secular referred to temporal or earthly matters, and Taylor dubs this secular sub 1. Secular in the second sense, secular sub 2, is what most people associate with the word today. It expresses an idea that's crystallized in the Enlightenment, that societies can have an a-religious and hence allegedly neutral space at their center. Secular here means detached from religion, and religion comes to mean something private and free of public consequence. Secular in this second sense is typically regarded as the default position in human affairs, and religion is something added on. The third sense of secular, the one that Taylor is unpacking in his book, denotes, in his own words, quote, a move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option among others and frequently not the easiest to embrace, close quote. Many Americans in the late 18th century may have been eager to establish a secular government, secular type 2, in the sense that religious tests for office were prohibited. But the religious belief of individual office holders was not regarded as eccentric, irrational, or dangerous. In a secular type 3 age, religious belief, especially if it involves belief in a God who is creator and judge, a God like one described in the Creed, has become, for most individuals and institutions, a bizarre abnormality. For most of human history, the denial of supernatural realities was unimaginable. For our age, belief in the supernatural is unimaginable. We're living in a dramatic new chapter of the story of human history. When I talked with Smith about his book and Taylor's, I commented that maybe one of the reasons some people don't appreciate how deeply different our age is from other ages is that they don't relate to the history of ideas and culture as an unfolding narrative, but as a kind of static catalog of available arguments, some successful, some unsuccessful. That is, they fail to appreciate how cultural changes sustain a momentum that renders some beliefs unbelievable or unimaginable.
I do feel like there is a bit of a tendency to be interested in the history in a reductionistic way. Mm-hmm. That is, you sort of mine the history for propositional content from which you then create kind of deductive arguments. Mm-hmm. But the moment you do that, it's a little bit like the way analytic philosophy relates to the history of philosophy, which is, sure, you read Aquinas, you read Augustine, you read Leibniz, but you're not really interested in the contingencies of the history and story that embedded them. You go back because you're looking for other resources for different propositions to then run formal logical analysis. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I do think that's a little bit of a tendency. I think it's a very modernist kind of tendency, and I think it's something that unwittingly evangelical Protestants have absorbed. So even if we're interested in history, we treat it almost as a kind of a well or a fund for going back and looking at what other people claimed, and then we just read it that way. Mm-hmm. Whereas Taylor is saying, no, there's so much zigzag possibility. There's so much contingency. There's so many factors that shaped where it was going, that the only way to feel this reality is to kind of experience it as a story. Mm-hmm. And what makes sense in a story, the sort of narrative logic of a story is different than the deductive logic of a syllogism.
Of an argument, yeah.
Yeah. There's a literary theorist at Rutgers named Colin Jagger who I think has written just a brilliant piece reading Taylor on this, where he says, look, Taylor is a romantic, and Taylor says guilty as charged. And he says you almost have to read A Secular Age like a novel, because there's a kind of narrative flow that you have to kind of absorb the story at that imaginative level to really get it.
Mm-hmm. Before A Secular Age was written, Taylor was best known for a book called Sources of the Self. Those are both two big fat books,
Yeah.
and both appear to be kind of definitive in some way.
Yeah.
What do they do? What do they each do differently, and how do they sustain each other?
I don't know that Taylor ever really quite frames it this way, but I think there is a way that you can read A Secular Age as a kind of sequel to Sources of the Self. Sources of the Self was probably more focused on questions of identity, and therefore, what are the moral sources available for cultivating a sense of who we are and what we're called to be, and so on. And interestingly, I think there is a similar kind of quasi soft apologetic going on there, in which it's a critique of modernity and whether it really has the resources available to cultivate the authenticity that it wants. In A Secular Age, I think, in a way, he covers some of the same ground, right? I mean, he's telling a similar story, or at least he's traversing over the similar terrain. But his brief is different in that now he's asking, how has it become virtually unbelievable that there's a God, right? I guess you could say it's more focused on these questions of disenchantment, the shift in plausibility structures, whereas the earlier work, in a way, I think the earlier work was tied to some of his more political stuff about multiculturalism, the politics of identity, things like that.
And now, in A Secular Age, a big claim is that that now even believers regard belief as optional in some way. That it's not the assumed or default position. That it is a kind of choice in a way that it had never been. Is that a fair way of saying?
Yeah, or at least you have to, if you've got your head out of the sand, you have to in some way grapple with the fact that you have neighbors for whom this is not only not the default for them, it is unbelievable,
unimaginable.
It is right. It's just like they can't even get their head around why you would entertain. Now that's you'll feel that more if you live in the Midwest. If you live in a place like Grand Rapids, Michigan, the dynamics here are different. But all you have to do is kind of have a subscription to the New York Times, and you can feel what he's talking about.
The phrase post-secular has been showing up more and more. In fact, I think you wrote an essay in an anthology. It shows up principally in the academy, and I always tend to wonder how post-secular.
Right.
It seems that Taylor would suggest that we can never be post-secular.
That's a great point. I think the way the phrase post-secular is used is actually post-secular in the second sense. So if in modernity and in the sort of Enlightenment mythology, we were secular because we had achieved scientific, rational neutrality and objectivity, and we had thrown off the tutelage of faith and tradition and authority and so on. If that's what we mean by secular, and in a way, that's kind of, that's a long history. Even Freud and Marx took themselves to be scientific in that sense. That notion of secular neutrality and objectivity, that just comes in for really trenchant critique in the 20th century from Heidegger onwards, Gadamer, Derrida, right? There's this whole critique of that myth of neutrality. I would say in my tradition, Kuyper and Dooyeweerd were pushing that already in the early 1900s. And to be post-secular then would be to own up to the fact that nobody has this neutral standpoint. Nobody has this, in a sense, nobody has an a-religious standpoint. Everybody's starting from some confessional beginning. But then, yes, you could be post-secular and yet still say that with Taylor we live in a secular age, because what that means is you have a pluralism, a plurality of really different fundamental myths about the world.
And in a secular age, the only account of the world that has superior standing is the one without any God. Naturalism, or what Taylor calls exclusive humanism, is the default position in our secular age. It's worth noting that the critique of the myth of neutrality that Smith described hasn't trickled far out of the academy into public life. Try to make a religiously based argument about public policy, and you'll discover that confidence in a Type 2 secularism is still very strong. Defenders of First Amendment separation of church and state still make arguments rooted in 18th century assumptions about the secular as neutral. Having read a number of other books by Jamie Smith, I was curious about the audience he had in mind for How Not to Be Secular.
One of the things that I struggled with kind of pulling the trigger on finishing this book is because I felt like there were two audiences that I really wanted to reach with it. Because I felt like there's actually could be a lot of interest in a book like this quite beyond the regular sort of circle of Christian readers that would know my other work. Only because Taylor's A Secular Age has been so widely engaged in the academy, including the social sciences and philosophy and theology. And I know that in interdisciplinary settings, people have found it intimidating. So I wanted to serve those audiences, and I wanted to write a book that could be read by those folks. However, as I was working on this, what I really started to feel was the kind of existential import Taylor's argument has for, Christians who are trying to live faithfully in this kind of fraught context. And that really bubbled up, to be honest, when I led a semester-long seminar on the book with undergrads here at Calvin College, and was so proud to see them wrestling through this, and then saw all these lights come on for them in the way it helped make sense of their own experience. And then as I started having conversations with church planters and pastors in urban contexts, I started to realize, oh man, actually, this should be like a D-Min course in a box, because this might be the kind of ethnography of Manhattan or Seattle that they need to make sense of their new context. So because I was publishing with Erdman's, and because that's a little bit of a sort of go-to audience, I ended up, I think, framing the book probably more towards that latter audience. But I do hope it would be a book that non-Christians could read meaningfully as well. I'm not really trying to push an apologetic line necessarily, or I don't know. I try to hedge a little bit in the book so that others could find it helpful.
Mm-hmm. There's one phrase here that I want to ask you to, in your preface actually, where you talk about some of the audience that you have in mind, and I actually thought it raised some interesting questions about your other work, and I have to confess to a certain amount of perplexity in this.
Okay.
So you talk about, you say, friends who are ministers, pastors, church planters, social workers engaged in religious work in a secular age. And you've just described folks like that in Manhattan or somewhere. But then you say that heirs of Dorothy Day and heralds of an almost unbelievable story, they refuse to retreat to homogeneous zones of shared plausibility structures. And a light went off at that point, because it seems to me that, let me be very blunt. It seems to me that the church, that's precisely what the church should be, a homogeneous zone of shared plausibility structures.
Sure.
So what do you have in mind? What are you talking about here, and what aren't you talking about there?
Totally. Great. That's great. No, I think you're right. And in a way, I think one of the implications of absorbing Taylor's argument should be a renewed focus on cultivating the church as a space that very intentionally shapes our plausibility structures, and does that imaginatively and narratively and liturgically. What I was thinking of was, but doing so in ways that are, well, to use Hunter's term, faithfully present to these other cultural realities. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's partly writing from the standpoint of living in the Midwest. It's still, there are parts of this country where you could still pretty viably live in a relative bubble from modernity, from this pressure of modernity. And I don't know. I guess I was feeling like there's something kind of inherently irresponsible about that sort of response, a sort of withdrawal. It's not that we aren't centered in communities that have a homogeneous plausibility structure and that are reinforcing that imagination. It's that we aren't only there, right? We're not withdrawing to that space. From that space, we then lean out and are sent into these other more fraught contexts to bear witness, but also to collaborate. I mean, I do think meaningful cultural labor will require collaboration. And that means we need to be out there and therefore have to face up to this reality.
And have to recognize the kinds of conditions of soul that our neighbors are in. And recognize why the way we live or what we believe is so remarkably implausible to our neighbors.
Yes. And to then therefore be sent out into these other spaces with, I hope, a kind of empathy.
Right.
And sympathy for why people are where they are, right? Instead of, it's easy to get on a kind of moral high horse or sort of pious high horse and be like, how, what happened to Christian America?
Right.
Whereas it's like, in some ways, it's less interesting to ask, why aren't these people Christians? It's more interesting to ask, why might they be? What are the little, when somebody tells me that they're spiritual and not religious, instead of lamenting that, there could be a sympathetic frame in which I'm like, okay, there's an opening here, because obviously you don't want to settle for calculating rationality or just sort of flatten naturalism. So that's worth listening to.
Yeah. Now one thing, when I read that phrase, your criticism of the homogeneous zone of shared plausibility structures, I was pretty sure that you had some kind of Midwestern thing in mind, but there is a phenomenon that I see, and maybe you see it also, that does make me a little nervous, and that's people who come out of some kind of fundamentalist background whose eyes are open to what's going on really in the world, and then they adopt a kind of, let me call it, amphibious position where they want to kind of be in both worlds, not just to empathize, but I actually jotted down the phrase, the bittersweet delight of basking in ambivalence. I'm not sure.
Yes, yeah, that's good.
I think that some people are tempted to kind of stay in between there because they realize the struggle that their neighbors are in. And I think some people may be afraid of getting to the point where they can affirm with confidence what it means to be a Christian.
Right. I think there could be something to, I mean, there's something about emerging generations too, in the way that identities are forged, that they're quite comfortable with a kind of code switching, sometimes it's called, right? So in other words, you can totally be this person in one context, and you can play this game in your other context, and you don't necessarily have to integrate those things.
Sure.
I think that's right. And I agree with you. I mean, I think especially those who have emerged from a really insular religious fundamentalism are those who are then most susceptible of just being plunged into the affirmation mode of cultural engagement, right? It's why the reform notion of common, they hear the reform notion of common grace that says yes to culture and like, oh, great, I can say yes to everything. And I think what you and I are talking about is a mode of being engaged, but also centered in the biblical narrative, the people of God, the gospel as enacted in worship. And it's that centering that gives us a center of gravity so that you then know who you are when you lean out into those other engagements.
And you can retain that identity and still express empathy. And not, I guess one of the other temptations would be to live ironically all the time.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's actually, I mean, that's probably coincident with the kind of ambivalence you were just describing too, right? You don't commit to anything.
James K.A. Smith, professor of philosophy at Calvin College, where he holds the Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. He also serves as editor of Comment magazine and is the author of many books, including How Not to Be Secular, Reading Charles Taylor.